have the honour to be the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, a think tank set up by Mrs. Thatcher to encourage the Conservative Party to think along the right lines. We've long been working on energy policy, largely due to the hard work of Tony Lodge, our energy expert. The question of energy security in the future has been one we've been highlighting for a long time, and it seems never to go away. So it's fantastic to hold this event this evening. New foundations for a coherent energy policy. Speakers will speak for 5 or so minutes first, and then we'll open the debate out to your questions. So we'll start straight away with Tony. Tony is the Director of Political Communications at New Century Media and a long-standing research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. He's the author of Rail's Second Chance, a pamphlet which has clearly influenced government policy, which we hope to see policy changed as a direct result of that. And he has also been the author of numerous pamphlets since 2005 on energy policy. Tony.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Tim. And what I want to do is, we do have some research coming up from the Centre for Policy Studies on energy security in advance of the Paris climate change talks, which are occurring just before Christmas. So I'm not going to let you know exactly what's in all of that, but I will aim to give you a situation kind of where we think the situation is, given the fact we now have a majority Conservative government. We've left the Liberal Democrat-run Department for Energy and Climate Change behind, and we would like to see and think there is real grounds for a more coherent energy policy, to quote the manifesto, to help hard-working families and UK industry in the course of the next 4 to 5 years. But we think there are major problems which are imminent. There is something going on right now which we think could cause the Conservative government real political and economic problems as early as 2017-18, which may seem some distance away, but it isn't really. Next year is 2016, and then of course we're into the mid-term, and then we, in theory, face a general election in 2020. Our calculations show that far too much generating capacity in the electricity grid is closing far too quickly. And National Grid will publish its winter outlook next week, but that winter outlook will be for this coming winter. The winter of 2016-17, we think, could cause major problems for the United Kingdom's resilience of its electricity supply and its price. In the last 6 months, we have lost over 15% of our electricity generating capacity for 2016-17. 3 large coal-fired power stations have prematurely announced their closure, Eggborough, Longannet and Ferry Bridge, and there are question marks over another 2. The government in 2012, the coalition government led by, at the time, Chris Huhne, the department was rather, published the gas generation strategy, which hoped to see the construction of a significant number of new gas-fired power stations. Gas is cleaner than coal, and the government wishes to see them as a part of the decarbonisation process. But none of these new gas-fired power stations are in the planning system, are being proposed, apart from one last month near Lincoln, Long Sutton. So the 28,000 megawatts of new gas at the moment is looking like possibly 1,200 megawatts. So the argument we're making is that as the older nuclear power stations close in 2021, and with the new, much talked about Hinkley C new nuclear power station meant to open in the mid part of the next decade, though EDF will not commit to a date, we can see a major problem where we just don't have enough capacity going from the old capacity, which we still have now but is beginning to close early, to new capacity coming on and replacing it. And we're not talking about wind turbines or solar, we are talking about what we call base load power capacity, which is the capacity which supplies the minimum demand in the system. Traditionally that has been provided by coal. The Coalition introduced a carbon price floor in 2013, which sets a minimum tax on the emissions of CO2 from power stations. That's largely what has killed coal on the grid and why the companies are closing the plants early. We would argue they're closing them too early. The tax is too high. Plants on the continent aren't being taxed at this rate. The problem as we see it is that if we get to a stage in 2016-17 where yet more is closing too early and not enough new capacity is being brought on to replace it, then we can see price spikes, we can see a political problem for the government, the Conservative Party, and we can also see, and I'm very wary of using the term price cuts, but we can see a situation where we have electricity rationing. And I think that is a real concern, because where we have the situation where our energy-intensive industry is having to pay more for its energy than our European competitors, and where we have power stations which do in theory produce rather cheap electricity, to close them early without comparative replacement coming on as they go, and National Grid I think will detail this more next week, is a very dangerous situation. That's the first point of what I wanted to say. The second point I wanted to say was that with the advent of a Conservative majority government, I think there is now huge opportunities for a new piece of energy legislation, even dare I say a new energy bill, because the 2013 Energy Act, which the Liberal Democrat-led Dept brought in, is already in theory out of date. The Energy Act expected and predicted that fossil fuel prices would soar going forward. We now have record low prices in the coal price, the gas price is very, very low, and we are seeing what the Energy Act was designed to tackle not in any way, shape or form being relevant for the foreseeable future. I think the other issue which we need to have by the government is when the Secretary of State goes to Paris before Christmas, I think it's very important that Parliament is told what the government's red lines are in what it will be negotiating and what it will be talking to its global partners about. And I think that could take the form of a statement to Parliament or a written statement. And this is the reason why I say this is as follows. In 2003, Tony Blair signed at a Brussels summit and admitted subsequently that he had signed a renewables target agreement, which was then in law, carried into law, which committed the United Kingdom to getting 33% of its electricity from renewables by 2020, which is a Herculean ambition and which has cost people a lot of money in the subsidies needed to get there, to get even close to it. Blair subsequently admitted he didn't realise that is what he had signed. That is in a document, it's available on an FOI. He thought it was 33% of energy, which is slightly different. The situation, I think, is very, very important, both for the Conservative Party and the country, as we get to a stage where our European competitors are seeking, and Redcar is part of the problem because the Redcar energy-intensive industry, which sadly is going to close, they're paying more for their electricity than, for example, steel mills in Italy or Germany. We, I think, have an opportunity now to row back on the levies and on the taxes we've put in place, which does risk something of an energy crisis in 2016-17, possibly beyond, when we do have an opportunity to get the decarbonisation we want, to get the CCS, which I think is achievable, and I think CCS has to be England and Scotland. I think it would be a precarious situation if the billions of pounds went to a Scottish project, just when we are possibly on the verge of, by 2020 in theory, another Scottish referendum. I think UK taxpayers could be hugely exposed if we give that subsidy to a Scottish project at Peterhead. I think there has to be an English project with a pipeline where we can get into those depleted North Sea oil and gas wells and get enhanced oil recovery going, which will bring in more revenue for the Exchequer. But I will leave it there. I'm not going to say anything about shale, that's where Ken will come in. But I think there's a real opportunity for the Conservative Party to now help get bills down, boost energy security, avoid problems in 2017-18, which aren't that far away in theory, because if we do lose any more capacity prematurely, and National Grid were not expecting to lose Eggborough or Longannet this early. Longanet's the big coal station in Scotland, Eggborough is a big coal station in Yorkshire, then we're losing far too much off the grid too early, and we don't have the equivalent capacity being built to replace it. Thank you.
Tony, thank you. I'd now like to introduce Ken Cronin, who is the Chief Executive of UK Onshore Operations Group, which is the trade body representing the fracking industry. Before he was appointed there a couple of years ago, he was Head of Global Energy at Creed Gavin Anderson. And Ken.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to broaden the debate out slightly and talk about energy in its widest form, and in particular gas. But I'd like to make a comment about the energy trilemma that everyone talks about: emissions, cost, security. This is not the first time we've had an energy trilemma. In the mid-60s in the UK, we had a 60% dependency on coal and 38% dependency on oil, which was all imported. So 98% coal and oil for all our energy needs, so heating, transport, electricity, etc. We saw how weak that was in the 70s when we had the oil price crisis and also the miners' strike. But we solved that trilemma with North Sea oil and gas. Gas replaced coal in heating. We saw a massive reduction in emissions, particulates, etc. So my first comment really is that from a trilemma point of view, we've done it once before, we can do it again. I would like to see as many countries in the world as possible actually use the evidence that we've got to move from coal to gas as quickly as possible, because it's worked here. But I'd like to sort of talk about gas, and in particular shale gas. Today, in the last half an hour, 40% of our electricity was produced by gas. You'll find no one in our sector that runs away from decarbonisation of the power sector. We do need it. We have policies designed to get to that point. We will still need gas, and even Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace recognise that as balancing and peak load. And most people talk around 10 to 15%. But that's, in the longer term, and I accept Tony's proposition in the shorter term, but in the longer term, actually, we have other bigger challenges. 85% of our homes are currently fed by gas for heating and cooking. 85% of our industries are fed predominantly for heating and cooking by gas. Gas is by far a cheaper form of heating than electricity is. If you actually do the study, you find fuel poverty in areas where electricity heating is at its highest. And so that's also an important consideration. Moving on to transport, 1.5% of the vehicles in this country create 20% of the emissions, and they're the trucks. In the US, major truck fleets are now run by shale gas. People like FedEx, etc., have moved over from diesel to CNG, and I think that again is something we need to consider. And finally, gas is such an important part of our economy. Everything people are wearing tonight has gas in it. Your mobile phones has gas in it. When you wake up tomorrow morning, you will use toothpaste that has gas in it. Everything that we use has gas or hydrocarbons in it, and really fundamental building block of our economy. Just like to touch again on heat, because I think that is, after electricity, that's the next big challenge in terms of the trilemma. And I think a lot of people actually have their heads in the skies on this one. I hear a lot about electrification of heat. So let's look at the facts. Today, at our peak winter period, our peak electricity is somewhere between 50 and 60 gigawatts. Our heat capacity demand is 300 gigawatts. So if we were to electrify heat tomorrow morning, we would need 6 times the amount of electricity generation than we do now. And that would only be used 3 months of the year at most. So from an economic point of view, the electrification of heat is by far a very expensive dream. And as Tony says, we already have problems in electricity alone. So we do need to find a solution to heating and decarbonisation, etc. But gas has to play a very long-term role in heating in this country. So the question then comes is, if we have this high dependency on gas for a very long time, where do we get it from? 16 years ago, we were totally independent gas producer in this country. We actually exported gas elsewhere in the world. Today, 16 years on, it's about 50%. We import the other 50%. Today, we spend £18 million a day on imports. National Grid estimate that within the next 16 years, we will have an import dependency of 92%, and that will cost the UK £10 billion a year. That gas will come, the extra gas will come from continental Europe, and ultimately Russia is feeding continental Europe, or through LNG, principally from Qatar, potentially from America. But again, from a trilemma point of view, there are economic and environmental consequences of that. Number one, in terms of transmission across Europe, continental transmission pipelines leak about 1.5% into the atmosphere as part of transmission losses. That has a major impact on the environment and an economic impact. LNG, to take LNG from Qatar, you have to freeze it, you have to liquefy it. You then transport it, and then you regasify it when it gets to the shores of the UK. And that takes 13% of the gas that's actually transported. So again, economic and environmental impact. LNG also is the first time we've ever had fungible gas where you can transport it anywhere around the world. When we had the Fukushima disaster, the estimates were that there were 450 tankers full of LNG around the world, and they all went to Japan. Within 1 hour, LNG prices went up by 55%. If we'd had a pipeline come off from Norway, it was a cold winter, we would have had to pay through the nose for a tanker full of gas that would last us about 3 days. So from a security point of view, there is also a major impact. I also think it's quite interesting the view of one of the trade unions, the GMB, who recently said that there's a moral implication for taking gas from places like Qatar, who have no environmental regulation to talk about very significant human rights issues. So actually they have advocated to their membership, the second biggest union in the country, that actually they should support shale gas production. And to put that into context, talking about shale gas, the estimates are that we have somewhere between 1,300 and 1,400 trillion cubic feet of gas underneath our feet in this country. That's against a current consumption figure of 3 trillion cubic feet. We're not going to get all of that gas out of the ground, but even if we got 10%, that gives us 50 years worth of gas supply, which gives us time to sort out electricity, it gives us time to sort out heating, but it will still be a major player even in 50 years' time. And I'm very pleased that we've had broad political support for shale gas in the UK. I admit that we are having difficulties with local decisions, dealing with local communities. But the reality is anyone that's worked in onshore energy, whether it's wind, nuclear, biomass, etc., national energy policy, local decision makings are very, very difficult bedfellows. And every single energy production in this country has had issues with local communities, anti-groups, etc. But I do think shale gas is a very, very big part of the energy trilemma question, just like the North Sea was 30, 40 years ago.
Ken, thank you very much indeed. I now ask Dan Lewis. Dan is an old friend of the Centre for Policy Studies. He's now Senior Advisor on Infrastructure Policy at the IOD and an acknowledged energy expert.
Thanks very much, Tim, and delighted to be here. Well, we've got 34,000 members, most of them are small and medium-sized enterprises, And one of the big concerns that always comes through is the cost of energy, because it's a key economic input. So I thought what I'd focus on today are what I think are the two most interesting energy challenges for this government. So first of all, creating a framework for delivering cheaper nuclear power after Hinkley Point 2, Hinkley Point C, and then secondly, bringing the costs and technical issues of the smart meter program under control. We historically have always been in favour of competition, and I was very impressed with the United Arab Emirates and the competition they organised for nuclear power, which has actually delivered South Korean supplies at roughly a third the cost per installed megawatt EDF are going to do with Hinkley Point C. And this is really because they organised the competition. And I think we need to have a sort of discussion about how do we organise a competition for the next generation of nuclear power that comes next. So, very lucky to have, I should say, Lady Barbara Judge as our chair, so we've been looking at this going forward, and we're going to keep doing that. But first of all, clearly you have to have more bidders than there are contracts, and that has been difficult for a while because only EDF had actually gone through what's called a generic design assessment, but there will be new designs coming through shortly. It's from Hitachi and also from Westinghouse, and I understand there's some more on the way. So they're not far away, about 18 months, 2 years. But the way I think it could work is critically the government could, because they own the land through the Nuclear Commissioning Authority, there are a number of sites where they could actually auction. And they could say you would have the rights to divert nuclear power stations on this site, and then you have a competition. And I think what's critical as well is that you need to start saying we need not just 3.2 gigawatts or 1.1 gigawatt. I think you need to say for each contract it might be about 5, because there is actually a very large requirement for nuclear power that goes quite far into the future. The way it's going, Tony's touched very lucidly on the declining number of power stations, but the fall in nuclear power from our older stations is actually quite dramatic. So we'll go from, I think, roughly about 9 to about 1.2 really quite quickly over the next few years. I think that has great promise, and you know, I'm sort of quite taken with how you know, I sometimes wonder what would a post-Putin Russia look like. It may not always be such an unfriendly place, and it's interesting that the Finns have now bought a design that's going to give them power at 50 euros a megawatt hour, which is pretty good. But from the Russians, you know, maybe at some point in the future we might start to consider buying nuclear power stations from the Russians. I don't know. But we hear a lot about small modular reactors. I do like the idea. They're certainly more financeable because they are modular, but they really are not available. And I don't think there are really going to be any available for about 10 years. But to have that availability, I think it would be interesting to for the government to sort of help these designs to come through. And this is really about getting a supply chain benefit as well, which I think this tends to be much more in favour of. Now, if either of those don't really come through, the backup I think we could explore is to build more interconnectors with France. So in France they set the nuclear power price every year. This year it's 43 euros a megawatt hour. I don't see why we couldn't build another couple of interconnectors by forward 10 years. I think there's going to be quite a lot of spare capacity in France in the years to come. I think the economy is in quite a lot of trouble, and that would be quite a good hedge. But so much for nuclear. Smart meters program is sort of the biggest infrastructure project you've possibly never heard of. But the National Audit Office puts the cost now, the lifetime cost, at 19.25 billion. It has 3 aims: to deliver what they call automated meter reading, to initiate some sort of a smart grid, and to create some kind of nascent energy data market. So its greatest advocates are the suppliers, because this takes a big cost out of their balance sheet. because inaccurate meter reading is one of the biggest bugbears for them dealing with their customers. And then the telecoms companies, and of course the meter manufacturers. But I think what's really gone wrong is what's called the problem of concurrency. And I think of the F-35 fighter jet program, but really what you should never do is start the production installation before the design and testing is completed. And I think that's actually what's happened here. So we now have 2 million, forgive the jargon, they're called SMETS1 meters installed across the country. And they're not compatible between different suppliers, which means that if you switch, your meter becomes dumb. And in fact, 10% of them already are. And so I think that's a major issue. I think there's been a lot of over-specification. I think it's much more complex than it needs to be. And it is a concern of mine that consumers are effectively writing a blank check because the benefits to consumers are much more hypothetical than for the other players in this, who are the suppliers. And there are no measures in place to recoup those benefits from the suppliers for the consumers. So if I was to have a wish list of what to change, I'm not against smart meters, but I think this really could be done much cheaper. I think what would focus minds would be to stop the rollout until all these designs and protocol issues have been finalised. And then I think you could start to open up the supply chain to off-the-shelf solutions. I would remove the off switch, the remote off switch, which I think needlessly adds complexity and a sort of security risk potentially, albeit a low probability one. And then one of the things the government's done recently, which I think is very good, is to look at alternatives to what they call the in-home displays. And this is because in its genesis, this program was really before the smartphone. And so the idea that you could examine your energy consumption on a phone was just not really done. But now 68% of the population have smartphones. And the other point as well is the government's spending so much money through BT on expanding the broadband network. And the trouble with any meter is, they're almost always in the most awkward place to get to in your home. And that is just where the mobile signal is at its worst. So, the feedback from a lot of these is that they're getting put in and they're not doing very well. So there are other connectivity solutions. One of them is called power line communications. This is what's being used in China to a great extent. They use very cheap systems, about $50 each. The cost per consumer is roughly about £400 per household. And then look at sort of broadband connected to the cloud solution. So if you can start to look at some of the new clip-on devices that are coming through, you could, instead of this program formerly costing 10.9 billion, it's been put at costing something like 2 billion, which makes me rather excited, thought that you could save that much money. So, in sum, what I'd like to say is, I think what we need is perhaps fewer and less binding targets, and much less concurrency. And I think, together, with some of these measures, we could, very likely deliver nuclear at possibly half the price, slightly more than Hinkley Point C will be. And then I think smart meters could be as much as a quarter of the price. Thank you.
And thank you. A number of short-term and long-term challenges have been thrown in Andrea's direction. If anyone can cope with the challenges, it's Andrea. Minister of State at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, previously Economic Secretary to the Treasury, MP for South Northamptonshire since 2010, and founder of the Fresh Start project. Andrea.
Thank you, Tim. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you all very much. I mean, some of those points I think I need to take away and look into, particularly some of the smart metering points I think are really well made. So thank you, Dan. I completely agree with what Tony's saying. There is a huge challenge that lies ahead of us. I don't agree that we're at serious risk of the lights going out. I mean, obviously, you know, if there's one thing we do that underpins everything else, it's keep the lights on. And so in terms of the trilemma, how I sort of think of it is that the big picture, the overall vision, is a decarbonised green energy future. The absolute focus for today, tomorrow, the next day, next year, next week, next month is keeping the lights on. And then, of course, within all of that, what we've got to do is do it at the lowest cost to the bill payer. And so that's kind of how I see the trilemma, is everything we do has to be towards this green energy future, but without compromising on keeping the lights on. And, of course, we've got to keep the bills down. So so to start off with, just to very briefly set the scene, of course, we are doing quite well in a big picture sense, and I think it's a well-made point that we've done it before, that we've addressed the trilemma before. I think is exactly right, and I think we will address it again. Coal obviously is the bad guy. Unabated coal is something that we need to move away from. It was put to me, and I still don't have the source, but I shall riskily repeat it, that if you reduce coal use by 1% and increase gas use by 1% in the UK, so you're swapping 1% of coal for 1% of gas, it's the equivalent in the UK where we are today of increasing your renewable generation by 10%. So actually, if you're looking big picture, how do you decarbonise as fast as possible? The answer isn't to switch off fossil fuels and switch on wind. Of course it's not. Then you lose all of your other points. You've made it much more expensive and the lights won't stay on. Actually, the quick win is to reduce your unabated coal use and increase your gas use. So I completely agree with what Ken's saying. Gas is absolutely essential for the future. And I caused something of a Twitter storm the other day because I was going to the G20 energy ministers meeting in Istanbul, and as I was going through passport control, there were great big left and right Statoil ads saying that gas is the fossil fuel that creates the decarbonised future. And I was like, oh yes, I photographed it and tweeted it, and of course lots of people were utterly furious. But it is the inconvenient truth. You know, you do a lot better to move to gas in the short term as a bridge to a decarbonised future than almost anything else you can do. So I think, you know, coal at the moment, roughly 30% of electricity, gas, roughly 30% of electricity, nuclear, roughly 19% of electricity, and renewables, roughly just over 20% and growing. So that's where our electricity is coming from right now. And of course, at the moment, our total energy still relies around over 80% on fossil fuels. So anybody saying switch off fossil fuels, just go for wind and solar, that's completely bonkers. That's how you would, actually people sort of say, you know, the world will end if we don't move to a decarbonised future. Actually, the world would end today if we took their advice and switched off fossil fuels and just went to wind and solar. So, you know, I would robustly defend the fact that we live in the real world, and therefore the real world means that we actually need to encourage a reduction in unabated coal. We've got to absolutely focus, as we are doing, on getting the most we can out of the North Sea Basin. You know, we've set up the Oil and Gas Authority specifically to do that, to focus on maximising the economic recovery. We're spending money as a government on seismic surveys of the North Sea Basin to try and look at unexplored areas, to try and promote further exploration, because we recognise that oil and gas is part of our energy mix for decades to come. So that's the first thing to say, is there is no chance in the near term that we move away from fossil fuels. That just cannot happen. However, what we've got to do is be on a path towards a green energy future, and we are absolutely committed to our legally binding targets for decarbonisation by 2050 and for our fourth and fifth and subsequent carbon budget. So we are absolutely committed to those. And what that means is this journey away from the dirtiest fossil fuels and to the greenest, the cleanest fossil fuels on our way to a renewable future. But some of the biggest problems, and I can say this now that we have a Conservative energy department, and let's face it, this is the first time we've ever had one. You know, it was invented by Labour and it was handed over to the Liberal Democrats, who, if anything, had even more of a magic money tree. And so, of course, when we came into office as a Conservative-led department, what we discovered was, of course, that, as ever, that kind of subsidy-led, demand-driven type of policy meant the day of reckoning had to come. So as you know now, through the rearview mirror, we had, unfortunately, you could say on the upside we were victims of our own success. We'd over-deployed, or at least we'd at least met our deployment expectations, they weren't even targets, well in advance of when the subsidies were due to come to a close. So we'd significantly over-deployed in some renewables, met our expectations in others, and of course the implication of that, because the bill payer was underwriting the whole lot, and in a form that meant as the wholesale price declined, so the costs to the bill payer went up. In effect, what we'd done is we'd created something that meant the bill payer would pay whatever it took. And so that's why when we came into office, we very quickly had to say, right, enough is enough, we've got to have a policy rethink. That day of reckoning had to come. It doesn't in any way undermine our commitment to a robust and successful renewables industry. And in fact, what I've been doing in the last few months is promoting our ability to export. Just last week I went to see the new Siemens site up in Hull that's going to be producing offshore blades for offshore wind farms. That's a huge, enormous and potentially enormously successful project that's going to be exporting around the world. We want to grow the supply chain. We want this to be an enormously successful British industry, but it can't be at any price. And so I want to be very clear, keeping the bills down is absolutely as important in the short term as that short-term support for the renewable sector. We do want to promote renewables, we will support them, but only to the point where they can stand on their own 2 feet. And the interesting thing is, once we announced the closure of the RO to wind a year early, a number of nameless energy companies came and said, well, could we have a CFD without a subsidy? Which I think is interesting, that last week it was impossible and suddenly this week it's possible again. So I do think we've all got to not be naive. Businesses are entirely pragmatic and will do exactly what you pay them to do. And if you stop paying them to produce renewables in an expensive way, then they'll produce them in a cheaper way. That's not to say that the support is gone. We're currently looking at what more we want to do, and we'll be making announcements very soon. But I absolutely think the essential thing for me as Energy Minister and for our department is to come up with policies that are absolutely transparent to businesses, that are tech neutral, so we're not picking the winners. I mean, who would pick wind and solar, which are intermittent with no storage, for goodness sake? You know, if people really want to see a decarbonised future, then you solve the problem of intermittency alongside new generation. You solve the problem of insulation alongside new generation. You don't just generate loads of electricity, which is intermittent, that we're all paying for that plus the base support, and then you just have it all go out through your windows because you haven't insulated them. I mean, those just are not coherent policy. So what we want to have going forward is a set of policies that will be coherent, that are investable, so business people can see where do they want to invest and what is the nth investment that probably won't make sense because it won't make the cut-off, so they can actually see that for themselves. So that clarity and transparency is key, as is a coherent energy strategy that enables, as soon as possible, the bill payer to be off the hook, but at the same time promotes and supports the development of new technologies. So it's not just about onshore wind and solar, which have had a lot of bill payer subsidies. It's not just about offshore wind. Britain at the moment is half the world's offshore wind, is hugely successful. But what we also want to succeed in is CCS, carbon capture and storage, a way of lengthening our use of fossil fuels. We also want to succeed in marine and tidal. And of course, very importantly, we want to succeed in the next generation of nuclear power plants, which are vital for base supply. And so I completely share your enthusiasm for small modular reactors. I think, you know, some of the new technologies in nuclear, Britain could actually be a world leader in. You know, we are a world leader in decommissioning. I recently went to Sellafield and was equal parts amazed and horrified to see what's there and what we're doing with this. I mean, we've literally got, you know, the Japanese energy minister who I met in Istanbul last week was saying he'd had a fabulous trip to Sellafield to see some of the actions we're taking, and they're really learning from that. We can export those talents. We're building the National Nuclear College to try and ensure that we've got the skills, not just for decommissioning, but also for investing in a new nuclear industry. So I think there's a huge future for the UK, and you'll see within the next few weeks a coherent, conservative energy policy that I think actually people will be delighted with. And I do regret the bad publicity that we've had, but I think for people who really care about the bills as well as keeping the lights on and decarbonising, it actually was the only sensible thing to do. And the challenge for us is to turn it around and make it clear and effective as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you. To put everyone on the spot, I'll take the prerogative of the chairman to ask the first question, and that is that in 10 years' time, with the political climate being what it is today, there's every likelihood that there would have been 10 clear years of Conservative government at least. And that would mean that there would be no possibility of blaming any predecessor government for any energy failures. The energy strategy that you mentioned just now, is that going to create the clear guidelines by which you and your colleagues can be judged in 10 years' time?
I think that's absolutely our intention. I mean, the one thing I would say is, we can argue about how we do it, but I do think there is a genuine cross-party consensus about the direction of energy policy, in the sense that all parties are signed up to the need for a green energy future. And that in a way is a good thing. That's unusual, because you therefore don't run the risk of massive about turn on the big picture. And so we can argue about policies, and of course policies do evolve. And so, for example, just to take one example, if we saw SMRs getting off the ground, and if British scientists and inventors actually managed to get those off the ground sooner rather than later, you could actually see that becoming quite a significant part of the British energy future. On the other hand, if they go nowhere and 7-8 years' time we're still talking about them, then they obviously wouldn't play a big part, and it may well be that in fact shale gas is that big industry. So there are obviously, you can't know exactly where we'll be in 5-8 years' time. But yes, I would expect that there will be a coherent energy policy that will be very compelling and that will endure.
Thank you. Some questions? The lady on the right.
Hello, Claire Duffy. I'm UK General Manager with ESB. A question, I suppose, for Tony, but also interested in what others in the panel might say. Just by way of context, ESB is currently the only company building new gas-fired generation at the moment, just 10 miles from here in Carrington. And I was a little bit concerned, Tony, I wasn't sure what you were asking for on security of supply and how you would ensure that there is an appropriate balance between encouraging and incentivising the necessary new investment that we're going to need, and encouraging older plants to remain on the system perhaps for longer than they otherwise would. Because security of supply is, there's a number of issues, and one is that if you keep the older plant on the system for longer than they normally would, you are interfering in the normal exit-entry signals in a market. And in that case, at what point are you dampening the investment signal? And by purely keeping existing on at the expense of new, you're just kicking that can down the road. So I'd be interested to know how you ensure a policy to get that balance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, but the point I'd make is that obviously we have a low gas price at the moment, so the incentive to build new CCGT gas plants is less. In 2012, when Chris Huhne unveiled the gas generation strategy, the Dept document, it laid out the foundations of an ambition to have 28,000 megawatts of new CCGT on the system by about 2024-25. We hope to start seeing some of those planning applications beginning to emerge, well, certainly by now, but in the recent past, and we're just not seeing that scale of build. I think one of the ways you can incentivise that is with actually a redesign of the capacity market, which will provide a stronger incentive. But the one thing which I think which I think is clear, and I think National Grid are showing some concern, is if you don't have any of that stuff literally being built, and I think you're literally about to go online at Carrington, aren't you, or you just have, or soon. If you don't actually have that new capacity being built and then therefore coming on stream, I don't think it's I don't think it's right to close the capacity which you do have before new capacity comes on. Quite simply, you can't take 10,000 megawatts of coal out and suddenly find, I mean, we've got about 59,000 megawatts of dispatchable capacity in this country, and in theory, we might be on 60, 59, 58 quite soon. The maths are quite straightforward. I think you close capacity when you have got capacity about to open. And I think that's where the problems might start. And I don't think these will be power cuts, by the way, but I think they could be price spikes, which I'd argue are just as bad.
Sorry, can I just come back though and say that, you know, as the Minister pointed out, in terms of the lights going out, the National Grid does have the supplemental balancing reserve in place, and you know, at present is looking to increase the volumes that they will procure under that, and even that is a market intervention. And you know, as far as we're sort of concerned, I think if you look at what pre-qualified last year and what is currently pre-qualified for the capacity auction, it is oversubscribed. So you know, I just would caution on sort of any knee-jerk reactions on that.
I'm not quite sure whether the market works all the time. I think if you go back 15 years ago, we had electricity at £16 a megawatt hour. Every coal-fired power station in the country was burning as much as possible in order to just pay the interest on the bonds they had. Most of them collapsed, but they're still here. Our nuclear energy company, which was producing 35% of electricity in this country, also collapsed, and it's still here. So I'm not quite sure markets always work in terms of signals, etc. And I think the recent history in the UK kind of shows that.
Claire, I think that's a really, really important question. I do wonder as well, you know, there's been a big push for demand-side response, as it's called. You know, to the extent that I think there's one company, Tempus Energy, who threatened to go to the European Commission and say, you know, if you don't, we don't want gas-fired stations getting capacity. I forget what it's called, capacity credits, as it were, because that's taking away our market share of what we can load balance ourselves through our own demand-side response. So there are lots of players here, and deciding where the right balance is, I think, is a sort of ongoing, very tricky thing to do.
Another question, gentlemen.
Thank you. Luke Warren from the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. Sorry, excuse me. Tony spoke a little bit about the importance of carbon capture and storage for coal, and I was interested in a question probably primarily for Ken, although I'd be interested in views of the other panellists, about how important CCS is going to be for gas going forward. So I think Ken spoke about perhaps 50 years of supply, if we are able to extract economically 10% of our resource base of natural gas. How important is CCS to unlocking that full value?
I think it could be really, really important in terms of the heat question, actually. I think a lot of the debate is always around generation, and it sort of drives me completely nuts, because I do think heat is actually important. I think we've got some really interesting options in terms of heat. So we have fuel cells and fuel cell boilers, which need methane, and you need to reform methane in order to get hydrogen. I also think that we've got a national transmission and distribution system in this country that pretty much everyone in the world just thinks is brilliant. You know, we spent billions getting it there. So why don't we just move from methane to hydrogen and take the CH4, reform it, carbon capture and storage the carbon, and then you've got hydrogen, you've got a new fuel, and you use the transmission and distribution system. So I think it plays a really important part, and I think what's quite interesting, it could play a really important part in heating, and taking the carbon out and leaving the hydrogen.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
I wonder if I could just, sorry, Peter Bunce from Cleveland Associates. I was a little confused by the remit of the new Infrastructure Commission as far as energy is concerned, and wondered if any of the panel could clarify the extent to which what they will be doing and what will be left to
Well, yes, that's a very good question. So the idea is that the energy infrastructure in the UK needs billions of investment over the next few years. And I can tell you that I attend an interministerial meeting on big projects, which is sort of led by Jim O'Neill, who is the commercial secretary to the Treasury. And I think what's become increasingly apparent is when you look at some of the big infrastructure, not necessarily energy, but also roads, also rail, also airports, the enormity of the task is potentially something that needs its own special focus. And so, I mean, I'm not speaking with massive inside knowledge of exactly how this is going to work. I think it'll probably still remain to be scoped out. But certainly when I went to the last interministerial meeting, we were talking for a short while about Hinkley C and how complicated it is. And I was just remarking that actually that's probably the easiest one from a financing point of view, because the next ones will be more difficult, because of course EDF is largely French state owned and therefore seen as more investable than some of these smaller company consortia. And there was a general sort of, oh, really, around the room, you know, that these are very large, very complicated projects. So I certainly think if you like, you've got the sort of the jack of all trades, which the departments are. They look across the whole range and they come up with the policy and the strategy. But when it comes to the delivery of a massive project, having an infrastructure commission will be an enormous asset that's able to really delve into the detail and pull in the different pieces that are necessary. So I hope that answers the question. That's my expectation as opposed to my certain knowledge. Yeah.
In terms of getting more shale gas projects moving, and if you look outside the building here, then you can see the extreme sense of protests around a political event, but obviously this is something you deal with at a local level on a regular basis. What are the plans to encourage a wider public acceptance of the benefits of shale exploitation?
Okay, so I think there are a number of different ways of answering that. I think one of the things we as an industry needs to do, and that's the industry in its widest sense, so anyone from refining through to intensive users, etc., needs to start to tell the story of gas a lot more coherently. You know, when we go out and talk to people and you say, you know, the toothpaste you use has got gas in it, they say, really? You know, and I think one of the things, the big things that we have found is we have really lost our connection to energy. I was at a focus group meeting 18 months ago. A fairly elderly gentleman turned around to a group of younger people and said, "You don't get it. You've never had to carry energy into the home." And I was actually sitting in the background just looking at the faces and not a flicker. And some brave soul said, "Sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about." And he said, "Oh, I carried coal in from the pavement." And a couple of lights turned on, but still nothing. So some other brave soul turned to him and said, "Sorry, I still don't get it." And he said, "I burnt coal to create heat to my home, dummy." And I think, you know, one of the things we do need to do is bring a connection back in terms of energy with people, and that's, you know, goes through energy efficiency all the way through. Because at the moment we're in a plug-and-play generation where actually you walk into a warm room, you plug in your laptop or your games machine, and people really have no understanding where energy comes from. So I think one of the things we do need to do is talk about gas a lot more in terms of that. I also think that, you know, these debates have been happening throughout history. So, you know, currently about 50% of the people that you talk to about shale gas really don't care. You know, most people actually just say to us, you know, get on with it, we need gas. But there was an industry early 2000s that had a 3% approval rating around the country. Had associated health risks, a very virulent anti-groups, etc. Today we have 14,500 mobile telephone masts. and people are actually complaining there's not enough. And actually what I think we really do need to do is get on, do some drilling, do some fracking, show people the sites and say there's nothing whatsoever to fear. You can only do that by showing people, and I think that's what we need to do.
We need to talk about gas. Gentleman here.
Hi there. My name's Ali Abbas. I'm a local resident and also director of a community energy project. We've, over the last 9 months as volunteers, built up a project to raise £1.5 million from the local community to install solar panels on schools. And the announcement came a couple of weeks ago, and since then we've had to rapidly scale back. So our project now is only viable for about 5 schools that we've managed to pre-register. This has happened across the country to numerous community energy projects because it doesn't stack up with the new feed-in tariff and without pre-registration. So I would ask you, was your intention to kill off community energy? And if not, what will you do to help support the community energy sector in light of the cuts that have been announced?
Well, absolutely, our intention was to protect bill payers from what was rapidly becoming a massive overspend on what was already quite a difficult impact on bills. And so, you know, what we are very keen to see community energy projects, we're very keen to see household solar deployment, and we are looking at what we can do to defend them and encourage them. So as you know, there is a consultation on the feed-in tariffs which closes on October the 23rd, and we'll be reviewing the responses and looking very carefully at it and very sympathetically towards community projects in particular. So I mean, I think I would absolutely defend the fact that we needed to take that action. As you may know, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that actually, far from being a 7.6 billion cost per annum to bill payers by 2020 for policy cost subsidies, it will actually be a 9.1 billion, and that's where we are today. So if we were to continue down that path, we could be looking at an even greater cost to bill payers. So we had no choice but to take the actions we did. And of course, you may also know that that there are state aid implications of changing policies to favour one bit over another bit. And so it's not possible to just fiddle with it. You have to change the entire policy, and we are looking very closely at the consultation responses. I do hope that you've replied to the FITS consultation. Yeah, great.
So just to come back, you said you had no choice, but clearly there's another option, which is to pay for it from the general taxpayers' pot of money there. So in terms of investment in community renewables and in renewable energy more broadly, you tend to get a bigger return on that investment than you have to pay out. So to me, it seems like a choice was made on the basis of a fixed amount, which there wasn't really an exploration of what should we be using broader taxpayers' money to subsidise this, rather than just relying on bill payers to pay, which obviously has regressive implications as a result.
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, bill payers and taxpayers are the same people. So I accept your point. We decided that that it was not right to be going so significantly over the cost to bill payers or taxpayers. So I mean, the same argument would hold true. The point is that the subsidy had been dramatically overspent. So, for example, if you bust your budget for expenditure on, I don't know, family outings or dinners out or whatever, you don't sort of then say, oh, we'll just raid our children's piggy banks instead. It's family income, and that is how it is. You're either going to spend the money or you're not. And so the decision was taken. We'd significantly bust the budget, and so we were not going to continue busting it. It's already bust. And the other thing, just to be very clear, we are not removing previously agreed subsidies. This is not for existing projects, this is for new projects, and I've taken a lot of criticism for killing off the sector. Of course that's not the case. We have an absolutely blossoming sector. What this is about is the next deal, the one after that, where what we're saying is we've spent enough of bill payers' money, we're not going to spend any more, and simply transferring it to the taxpayer is robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Thank you. I'll take a last question or two if there are any. The lady on the right.
It's Zoe Keaton from RWE. It's a question for the Minister. A couple of times you talked about how the cost of renewables to bill payers has increased because wholesale prices have fallen. But part of, well, I believe, you could correct me otherwise, part of the reason for the fall in wholesale prices is because of the deployment of renewables. So clearly that's fallen across 100% of generation, and yet only a small proportion of that generation is subsidised under the CFD and receives that top-up. Has any analysis been done on the total cost to bill payers rather than just the use of the LCF, which is essentially a treasury accounting treatment?
That is actually a really good point, and I have a huge amount of sympathy with what you're saying there. And there is work done, which actually, you know, I mean, I want to challenge a bit more, shall we say, because there is a lot of work done which looks at effectively the counterfactual. So in other words, if we weren't doing what we were doing, where would bills be then? So you can always look at that and say, as a result of our policies, our overspend, and the generation of renewables, bills are, you know, £300 lower than they would have been otherwise. So that's sort of counterfactual. But actually, for people who are paying those energy bills, that's not really helpful. So saying, you know, we've cost you more than expected, but it's better than it would have been if we'd done something differently. I don't find that that's a helpful way to look at it from a political standpoint. People are dealing with their actual budget. So I agree with you intellectually, I'm quite sure, could make the case, and in fact there is research that shows that if you didn't have the renewable deployment, that you'd be paying more for other areas, whether it's whether it's the capacity market or the balancing services or whatever. But it's just not a helpful way to present it to bill payers who are actually struggling to keep warm and keep their own lights on. So I completely agree with you intellectually, but politically I just don't think it really works. I don't think it therefore argues for not taking the decision that we've taken.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I might just ask each of the panellists to very briefly summarise the degree of optimism they have for the future of the British energy market after 15 years of less than clarity, less than coherence. Are we going to see clarity and coherence in the future?
Well, my answer is I'm incredibly optimistic. I mean, we now have these superb renewable industries which have really got off the ground. We're really leading the world. You know, there is so much potential. There's a huge amount of supply chain gaps that we can still fill in to make our export offer even stronger. We've got new nuclear, which offers huge opportunities. We've got the National Nuclear College with its new training for new skills. That's a huge opportunity. We've got British engineering that already provide things like valves and parts for reactors all around the world, actually now looking at focusing on the opportunities at home. We've got the shale gas industry, where a report suggests that if that takes off and is successful, that could provide 65,000 jobs in the UK, new jobs that didn't exist previously, and around 30 billion of income to the UK. So I'm incredibly optimistic, actually, and I think that, you know, we will look back on this period of policy resetting, and it will seem like a blip in comparison to where we're going. I genuinely think that.
Tony?
I think a real ambition has to be, if you look at the United States, which is actually enjoying a significant manufacturing renaissance on the back of the fact it's got its energy bills down, and it has supported a significant shale sector, but it is also enjoying and making sure it continues to use the cheapest and most abundant fuels available. I'd like to see that kind of manufacturing renaissance and lower bills for consumers into the next decade. I think we will have challenges in the next 2 years to 18 months which could have political implications. I hope we can get over those, but if there is a country which we really should be looking at and hoping we can copy, then it's the United States, where you are seeing manufacturers, heavy industries, returning to America because it's managed to get bills down. A huge opportunity.
Yeah.
I feel quite optimistic. I think we've got some huge challenges ahead. One of my favourite stories is INEOS, one of the largest chemical companies in the world. based here in the UK. It's built 16 ships to take ethane from fracked gas from the US to Grangemouth. The reason why Grangemouth was built there in the 60s, it's the largest shale gas play in Scotland. And I find that really ironic. So I hope in the 10 years' time that we will be producing shale not only into Grangemouth but into various other refineries and providing manufacturing jobs to replace some of the ones we've lost in the last few weeks in North Sea.
Well, I think actually we are on a sort of verge of a generational shift in the energy and utility industry. And I do think actually we're going to see a lot of consolidation between telecoms and utilities, even burglar alarms. I think, you know, all these things are going to get packaged together. But I also think we should pay close attention to what's happening outside of Britain. And I think, you know, clearly that's happened through shale, but there's so much gas coming in the next few years as well. I'm optimistic that power prices can actually fall a bit further still, and even oil. But I would like to see a bit more happening at home.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for coming along this evening. For those of you who are not associates of the Centre for Policy Studies, take one of the forms that are on your chairs, not least so that you can get Tony's forthcoming energy report. But I'd ask you to join me in thanking the panel for an incisive and very illuminating discussion on a vital subject for Britain. Thank you very much.